Anybody remembers what I taught in the last class? I was teaching suicide, and we had discussed two types of suicide primarily. Egoistic suicide and altruistic suicide I had completed, and then we discussed the third type of suicide, just to summarize the old argument. Anemic suicide is symptomatic of a chronic state in the modern economy Anemic suicide rate is higher in the modern industrial urban democratic liberal societies than other kinds of societies. When individuals' needs and their satisfaction have been regulated by society, the individual becomes the embodiment of the collective conscience by learning the common beliefs and practices through institutionalized socialization process from birth to death. This is what we had primarily discussed. Then, when this regulation of the individual is upset, conditions for anemic suicide rate tend toward a maximum. The anemic suicide is rooted in the key term anomie, which means lawlessness or breakdown of the moral consensus. And this breakdown of the moral consensus may lead to unprecedented pathological, social, political, economic, or military situations. For example, what is happening in our neighboring country Burma or Myanmar is an example of breakdown of law and order. And although anemic suicide is not being reported, but it is situations like this which lead to a higher rate of anemic suicide in any society. For example, sudden wealth may be gained by a particular individual through pathological or anemic means due to legal or moral ambivalence prevalent in that society. For example, during Corona lockdown, in many countries of Europe, United States, and also countries like ours in Asia, there are many deaths which are being reported as COVID deaths, And I'm not talking about any one country, I'm talking in general about the ongoing corona pandemic. Now, what is pandemic? It is a combination of two factors, epidemic and panic. What is epidemic? COVID symptoms anywhere in the world, both in the first phase as well as in the second phase, are not something unprecedented. The world has seen many epidemics earlier, including the plague of early 20th century. It started during the First World War and continued until the end of the First World War, also overlapped with the new formations after the First World War. What happens during such situation is that at one side there is epidemic, whether it is plague or influenza or malaria. Then there was also something called AIDS. And then now it is corona. Corona is some sort of influenza which is caused by virus. But why it is called pandemic? Because this epidemic called corona fever, or as they say COVID-19, it is not only epidemic disease or illness, but it is conjoined with another phenomenon called panic. Therefore, more people are dying because of their earlier diseases, but there is a panic regarding corona, a psychological fear, intolerable psychological fear, and this fear is taking lots of lives. And all lives which are being lost are recorded as corona deaths. Now, this is very difficult to rely on any data regarding corona pandemic. And why Durkheim was writing this book? Because he had relied on earlier data of moral ambivalence of 18th century, 19th century, and he tried to present a general theory of moral cohesion. Now, as I said in the last class, and I'm just revising it so that I can make a few new points on the foundation of the last lecture, and to make sense in the class, I'm just repeating some of the arguments. In such anomic pathological situation of social life, sudden gain of wealth may become a strong stimulus of anomic suicide on the ground that the newly enriched individual is unable to cope with the new opportunity afforded him. And then, as you remember, I had discussed the case of farmer suicide in India, how poor farmers of North India do not commit so much suicide as farmers of the rich states of Maharashtra and Andhra Pradesh, or even Punjab or Haryana. Therefore, the theory which Durkheim propounded makes sense that in most societies, if not all, people are much more comfortable with misery, poverty, sudden loss of people, more so in countries like India, because the support provided by traditional institutions like family, kinship, professional groups on the lines Durkheim talks in the other book, Professional Ethics and Civic Morals. For example, take the campus called JNU. JNU has witnessed many episodes of normlessness, enemy, since 1972. But in this campus, there has been less suicide cases than in our neighboring Indian Institute of Technology, IIT Delhi, or All India Institute of Medical Sciences, AIMS. More students and faculty suffer from fear, mania, depression in JNU as well. But until very recently, the organic solidarity of JNU was very normal. And JNU was better able to negotiate with the economic situations than our neighboring AIMS or IIT Delhi. Why? Because in JNU, until very recently, there was a moral consensus. But was it not broken earlier? Yes, it was. For example, during emergency, the moral consensus was broken. That was a period 75 to 76, primarily 2 years. It started on 25th of June 1975 and ended at the end of 76. Then there was also normlessness in early 80s. In 1983, Indira Gandhi, as the chancellor or rather visitor of JNU, had come, and there was chaos and lawlessness and lawlessness. And now, for some years, there is again increasing amount of normlessness because there is less and less of moral cohesion. But in all the three episodes of normlessness or enemy in JNU campus, suicide rate was negligible. I cannot say that there may not have been any suicide, but it had not been accepted as suicide cases. There were other complications. Now, the point which I wanted to make is that the upper and lower limits of individuals' desires, his scale of life, and his expectations from life, or his expectation from relationships. I am talking his, but it also includes her. All these expectations are upset. Now, why there is less and less suicide among the poorer classes, or less developed section of any society? Because there is less desires, less expectation from life and relationships and institutions. Of course, when Durkheim proposed this, there was a lot of criticism, but people just accused him. There was no solid data to support the criticism of Durkheim, because it was going against the 18th century European Enlightenment, which said that material growth and material prosperity necessarily leads to more happiness, more meaningfulness of life and society. Durkheim was saying that meaninglessness or happiness both are more related with the moral cohesion or moral incohesion than with the case of material wealth or material prosperity on the one hand and material poverty on the other. Durkheim is trying to say that when people decide to take their life voluntarily by committing suicide, it is less related with their economic standing in the class system or even the caste system or the status groups than it is with the moral cohesion found in that society. I think there have been criticisms, and these criticisms look logical at the surface level, but when you inquire the details from the data, huge data, you are bound to agree with Durkheim that although a particular school of sociologists, both Marxist and neoliberal, emphasize that the real growth or the real development of society takes place in terms of material, acquisition of gadgets and comfort. But actually, the happiness and the success and the contentment of life or the meaning of life is much more dependent on the non-material aspects of society. And even Karl Marx does not disagree with this. In case you read his writings, whether it is the Communist Manifesto or even Capital 3 volumes, he is trying to provide a materialist interpretation of history, and he is not trying to promote materialism in society. We will take it up once we come to the substantive theory of Marx. At the moment, it is suffice to say that the Durkheimian theory of suicide, including the anemic suicide, doesn't contradict the canons of Durkheimian sociology. Both are complementary and not contradictory. The real contrast we find is between Karl Marx and Max Weber, and Max Weber and Jombart, and also between Max Weber and Wilfred Pareto. On the whole, all of them, including Karl Marx, they believed in a just society. They believed in the theory of justice, and they all believed in some sort of democracy. But how social justice can be achieved in a satisfactory manner is something about which there is wider disagreement among the theorists. Jombart, Max Weber, Wilfred Pareto, Émile Durkheim, and Karl Marx. Therefore, we should underline what Durkheim says, that the same type of situation occurs in conjugal enemy. I had already dealt this in the last class. The same type of situation occurs in conjugal enemy, exemplified by divorce. Here, marital society no longer exercises its regulative influence upon the partners, and the suicide rate for divorce is comparatively high. This anemic situation is more severely reflected among divorced men than among divorced women, since it is man who has profited more from the regulative influence of marriage. This I had dealt in the last class. Now what I want to add today is something which is controversial. Now take the question of health, social health. Now here you will find that almost in every society, even today, there is a huge gender discrimination, both at the level of social practice as well as at the level of social thought. For example, human body is a very important area of study in contemporary sociology since the time of Émile Durkheim. And now people like Brian Turner and many others, including also Michel Foucault, have studied human body. But since both are male, Émile Durkheim and Michel Foucault, I will not say it is natural, but this is cultural conditioning that they assume, disregarding anatomy and physiology of the human body, that male problems and female problems are more or less similar. No, it is not. For example, take two cases: menstruation among the young women and menopause among the elderly women. You will find very little sociological literature anywhere in the world, including United States of America, about the problems of a young woman and the problems of an elderly woman. Now, there is something called maternity leave in case you have a child. A professional who is also a mother is entitled, leave, paid vacation from the office or the institution But there is no provision that a young woman should be allowed leave, like maternity leave, when she is, undergoing very painful menstruation, or when she is negotiating with, very traumatic menopause. What does it mean? These are not something which is related with the individual. Menstruation is a social fact, like menopause. But since majority of writers among the sociologists also are male, they will not bother to inquire about, a problem which is specific to the female body. It is not publicly discussed because it is thought that it is something which is personal to the woman's body. But then the man's body also has a specific problem which is not related with the female's body. Then why you are discussing that? Therefore, although it is said very, very boldly that divorced men commit more suicide than divorced women. Fine. But I will add that after menopause, the immunity system of women all over the world is much more stronger than the male of the same age group. Therefore, what Simone de Beauvoir argued in the very celebrated book on the feminist writing, The Second Sex, should be read as a complementary text of Les Suicides by Émile Durkheim. Incidentally, both were French and both were of the same Jewish background. Now, what I wanted to emphasize is that, according to Durkheim, the individual forms of suicide can be properly classified once the three etiological types of suicide, egoistic, altruistic, and anemic, have been established. It is possible to describe the individual behavior patterns of those exemplifying these types. Other way around, seeking to find the causes of suicide by investigating the individual types is fruitless, according to Durkheim. You will find many people talking in the politically correct language that it does not matter how you present the fact. It does matter, according to Durkheim. And I am reading this sentence again. Once the three etiological types of suicide have been established, it is possible to describe the individual behavior patterns of those exemplifying these types. The other way around, that is the opposite of it, is fruitless. The other way around, seeking to find the causes of suicide by investigating the individual types is fruitless. What does it mean? Durkheim is trying to say that we should not be too much concerned with the cause of suicide. Rather, we should restrict as professional sociologists to the suicide rates. Better criminologists, psychologists, philosophers and poets speculate about the cause of suicide, whether it is anemic or egoistic or altruistic. We as professional sociologists are neither trained for nor we are capable of explaining suicide of an individual. Therefore, whenever a question is asked to us or to you, what is the sociological theory of suicide, then we should bluntly say there is no theory of suicide in sociology. Émile Durkheim did not give a theory of suicide, rather he gave the theory of suicide rate, and although he is classifying suicide on the basis of three etiology, egoistic, altruistic and anemic, it is not for causal explanation of suicide, rather it is for analytical purpose, it is for heuristic purpose, that this classification has been given in the book called Suicide in English and Les Suicide in French. Because in the same book, Durkheim has discussed not only the three major etiological types, but also mixed types of suicide. Let us see Durkheim himself, what he writes. In addition to the above mentioned three types, there are individual types of suicide forms which display mixed types, such as ego-anemic, altruistic anemic, ego-altruistic. What does it mean? As Max Weber was talking in the ideal types, that there can be different types of, legitimate social authority, traditional, rational, legal, and charismatic. In the same sense, these three types, egoistic, altruistic, and anemic, in Émile Durkheim, is also ideal types of suicide, and the book is not primarily about these ideal types of suicide, rather the book is about the relationship between the individual and social solidarity, the individual and community, the individual and society, and through the index of suicide rate, higher or lower, Durkheim is trying to assess whether the community under study, the society under study, or the social solidarity under study is morally cohesive or normal, or it is going towards the morally less cohesive and towards abnormal or pathological. The statistical data of suicide rate are correlated with the social phenomena, as I said in the first class on suicide also, such as the family, political and economic society, religious groups. This correlation indicates decisively that each society has a collective inclination towards suicide. This is fundamentally important sentence, and you should make a note. According to Durkheim, and this is in direct narration, this correlation of suicide on the one hand and family or political or economic groups or religious groups on the other, this correlation indicates decisively that each society has a collective inclination towards suicide. A rate of self-homicide which is fairly constant for each society so long as the basic conditions of its existence remain the same. This collective inclination confirms to his definition of a social fact. This inclination is a reality in itself, or noumena in the language of Immanuel Kant, exterior to the individual and exercising a coercive effect upon him. In short, Durkheimian theory of suicide rate can be summarized as A. The individual inclination to suicide is explicable only by relation to the collective inclination. B. This collective inclination is itself a determined reflection of the structure of society in which the individual lives. C. The aggregate of individual views on life is more than the sum of the individual views to Durkheim. Collective conscience, or the totality of beliefs and practices of folkways and morage, that is collective conscience in French or collective consciousness in English. It is the repository of common sentiments, a wellspring from which each individual conscience draws its moral sustenance. D. In Catholicism or the Catholic moral community, these common sentiments rigorously guide the individual and condemn the taking of one's own life. Therefore, the suicide rate among the Catholics is fairly low. In contrast, that is E, point E, in contrast, among the Protestant groups, these common sentiments lay great stress on individualism or individuation, innovation and free thought. The hold over the individual of society or the moral community slackens. He is tenaciously bound to society and can the more easily be led to suicide. If in less developed or traditional societies, the collective conscience holds individual life of little value, and self-immolation through suicide is a reflection of the society at work in the individual. G. In higher, that is developed modern industrial societies, where sudden crises upset the adjustment to which the individual had become habituated through the common sentiments and beliefs, common sentiments and beliefs enemy appears much more. That is, the suicide rate, anemic suicide rate is much more in higher developed modern industrial society, because they promote three things: individuation, innovation and freedom. Now the next point, suicide like crime is a normal social fact according to Durkheim at a certain percentage. Suicide like crime is a normal social fact at a certain percentage. For Durkheim, a certain percentage of suicide is no indication of immortality per se. In fact, a given number of suicides are to be expected in a given type of society. This is very cruel In case you are not a sociologist, Durkheim said, in a cruel manner, but he was just reporting a fact theoretically, that in fact a given number of suicides are to be expected in a given type of society. But where the rate increases rapidly, it is symptomatic of the breakdown of the collective conscience or consciousness and of a basic flaw in the social fabric. Now, Durkheim was criticized for this point. It was normal, it was expected. But what he was hinting at? He was hinting at a possibility which is very much on the horizon now. And what is that? Robotization of society, mechanization of work, where people will be trained to behave like a machine, or human workers, human labor force will be replaced by the robots or the machines. And he was trying to say that a certain percentage of crime and suicide is a blessing in disguise. In case there is a certain percentage of crime or suicide, it means that there is still hope in the possibility of a spiritual or moral evolution of civilization. In other words, as the others were trying to, formulate, for example, Herbert Spencer, that European society of 19th century was the most developed civilization on earth. Durkheim was trying to say no. There is still possibility of refinement and sophistication and development of society. We have definitely not exhausted all creative potential at our disposal. The example is that in case human beings as a whole, as a social fact, cannot be predicted on the downside, that is crime and suicide, they cannot be predicted on the upside also. Are you getting the point? Durkheim is a very, very humanist, social realist sociologist. He is trying to theorize about society not on the logical plane, rather he is trying to theorize about society on the basis of facts and figures found in the different types of society in different space and time in a cohesive humanist theory of society. Now, people like Theodor Adorno and Horkheimer in Dialectics of Enlightenment have criticized the very European Enlightenment of 18th century from that point of view. Durkheim and his theory of suicide rate can be criticized from that point of view. His views about division of labor in society can be also criticized. But then there are also supporters of Durkheim, the names I have mentioned earlier also. In case there is a critique from the side of the new critical theory of Horkheimer, Adorno, Habermas, Lukács, Walter Benjamin, Raymond Williams, then there are also supporters of Durkheim, Talcott Parsons, Redcliffe Brown, Edmund Leach, Levi Strauss, Marcel Mauss, Even Marxists like Althusser and Boris Godelier. Therefore, what I am trying to say is that from both extremes, the right as well as the left, there has been critique of Durkheimian theory, but when they evolve as a mature social scientist, as a mature sociologist, they agree that it is very difficult to discard Durkheimian canons, because in case we discard, then we will have nothing common. Everybody will have his or her own sociology, and that will be nonsensical. Anyway, it is, however, not the case that suicide and criminality are not correlated. It is only that both are homologous. Homologous, they are structurally similar, but the content is different. For example, men and women have different anatomy, but it does not make one superior and the other inferior. Both are homologous, although their anatomy and physiology is different, but they contribute, they function, they dysfunction in more or less the same way. That is homology, primarily made popular by Claude Lévi-Strauss in a structural anthropology. When excessive, that is, when suicide and crime both are excessive, both may indicate that the social structure is not operating normally. Suicide rate was found increasing rapidly through the 19th century. According to Durkheim, this rise in suicide rate cannot be held in its upward curve by education, exhortation, or repression. For Durkheim, all ameliorative measures must go to the question of social structure. In other words, Durkheim is saying that although suicide rate and crime rate both were increasing throughout the 19th century upwardly, but people were trying to either repress it through the police or the army, or they were trying to, repress it through religion. Durkheim said this is not going to work because both are trying to hit at the individual and not at the social structure. In other words, unless and until social structure is ameliorated of its inherent discriminatory practices, an egalitarian society is not possible. Last, for today, egoistic suicide can be reduced by reintegrating the individual into group life, giving him a strong allegiances through a strengthened collective conscience or consciousness. This can be accomplished through the re-establishment of occupational groups, compact voluntary association based on work interest. This is the main argument in his last published book, Professional Ethics and Civic Morals. What the book tries to, hint at, very sophisticated, theoretical, formulative way is that, egoistic suicide, or the person who is suffering from ego consciousness, what is egoistic? That the person as a member of society is led or forced to consider himself, autonomous or semi-autonomous, and he starts disregarding the neighborhood, the society, the community, the state of the market. This is a condition in the Marxist language of alienation. Durkheim said that this can be remedied, this can be reformed primarily by strengthening collective consciousness. This cannot be accomplished through the re-establishment penal law. This can be accomplished through the re-establishment of occupational groups, compact voluntary association based on work interests. The occupational group will also serve to limit the number of anemic suicides. Thus, suicide for Durkheim shows up the deep crisis in modern society. Indirectly, his book Suicide is an extension of the arguments he made in the division of labor in society and the rules of sociological method. Under the light of peer suggestions and criticism, lay suicide became the most substantive theory. Lay suicide became a book which had the most substantive theory of modern society, and it inspired Durkheim to revise his text of 1893 about the division of labor in society in 1902. It also led him to develop his arguments about professional ethics and civic morals. Indirectly, lay suicide of Durkheim made Max Weber's book on Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism some sort of ideological propaganda, and gave academic weight to Lombard's thesis on Jews and capitalism, as well as Marx's thesis in Capital Volume 1. At a third level, Durkheim presented a new dimension of alienated man in industrial societies and urban metropolitan settlements in industrial cities of Western Europe. Since he died in 1917 itself, he could not comment on socialist experiment in Russia or Soviet Union. It is, however, clear that unlike Marx, who was utopian and revolutionary, and also unlike Max Weber, who was pessimistic due to consistent bad health and also because of his neo-Kantian romance. The term romance has two connotations, one in German and the other in English, and there is huge difference. Now there is no time, therefore I cannot deal with the two types of romances, the German and the English, but on internet you have enough material. In case you wanted to check, you can check. Neo-Kantian romance with postmodern philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche. Émile Durkheim remained an optimistic reformer, firmly rooted in social realism, whereas Marx was utopian and revolutionary, although he claims that his socialism is not utopian, his socialism is scientific, but neutral critics have evaluated him to be an utopian German romantic, and there is nothing wrong in romance. Romance is a good thing. It is a juice of life. We can discuss this later on in case the time allows. But there is no doubt that Max Weber was very, very pessimistic. Marx was very optimistic. But people called that he was not a realist, he was more utopian, not utopian socialist, but utopian revolutionary in theory. But Max Weber was pessimistic, not only because of his bad health, but also because of his neo-Kantian romance with the postmodern philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche. Émile Durkheim remained an optimistic reformer firmly rooted in social realism. Had the social sciences paid more attention to Durkheim half a century or so ago, a good many false steps might have been saved, and we might be much further along than we are today. Even if his point of view in its entirety may not be acceptable, Durkheim had insights well ahead of his age. Therefore, we have completed our discussion of Émile Durkheim's suicide. Tomorrow, we will deal with Marxist theory of society. Tomorrow, I will introduce the Marxist theory of society. We have, of course, dealt with Marxist theory of individual and society earlier, but that was introductory lecture. Now we will deal primarily in reference to the book Capital, Volume 1, which was published as Das Kapital in German. Thank you, friends.